South African rugby, world champions in 2 consecutive World Cups, is the envy of the rugby-playing world. It wasn't always thus. Once was a time when local rugby was addicted to crisis. This is the story of how much of a crisis this crisis was, and how the crisis changed, and how South African rugby became peaceful. Welcome to the Luke Alfred Show. I have 30 years of experience on the front lines of sports journalism, covering some of the biggest games in cricket, rugby, the FIFA World Cup, and even the Olympic Games. Come and join me as we learn about some of the greatest sports stories you've never heard. I'm Luke Alfred, and welcome to the show. South African rugby is in a phase of such rude health at the moment that it is easy to forget that it wasn't always like this. Cast your mind back to Carl du Plessis' disastrous period as Bok coach, post-Andre Markgraaff, or, for that matter, the absurd reign of Nick Mallet's successor, Harry Viljoen. After Viljoen and his business speak came Rudolf Strauly, a member of the World Cup winning squad in 1995, and a man whose blood was a deep shade of brooding green. Strauly's pedigree counted for little. He racked up some record defeats. He also latched onto the idea of a boot camp, come Staaldraad, before the team departed for the 2003 Rugby World Cup. With grown men huddled naked in holes in the ground, it was difficult to see how the occasion engendered anything but irritable, dirty men huddled naked in holes in the ground. In his backward-looking way, Strauly's boot camp idea was well-meaning, but it was also a public relations disaster rivaling Watergate, the info scandal, and Iraq harboring weapons of mass destruction. It was so effective it did more than Strauly ever intended. It completely shredded team morale. Even a conspicuously gifted coach like Mallet had his ups and downs. This was partly because the broader environment against which his success played out was, like hydrogen, innately unstable, a very different state of affairs to where we find ourselves today. The administrators in Mallet's day were, for example, frequently delusional. Such delusions manifested in a variety of ways. They sometimes sucked their thumbs. They sometimes smoked their socks. They sometimes were so delusional that they thought they were the Springbok coach. When it was pointed out politely that the post was already filled, they were delusional enough to think, okay, they could at least be Bok selectors. When Mallet, or those close to him, told them to get back in their double-breasted blazer from Markram's, lace up their veldskoene, and reel in their necks, he was not the most popular man in the world. Mallet's success of 17 consecutive victories, notice they were never wins because they were bigger than that, made important people jealous, which shows just how divisive and fractured the environment in which he found himself was. There were other Mallet problems. He was also, self-evidently, his own man. He was English-speaking in a largely Afrikaans-speaking world. Such things were tolerated when he was winning, but became career-limiting when he began to suffer the occasional loss. When he had the temerity to criticize ticket prices prior to a home test at Kings Park in 2000, the men who were jealous had the excuse they were looking for. Nick was being indiscreet, they said. He didn't have a mandate to offer opinions about pricing. I mean, like, really. Noses were out of joint, and they had their revenge by giving Mallet, who had done that rare thing and won the 1998 Tri-Nations, a hefty boot. We know who they put up as alternatives, Viljoen and Strauly. South African rugby plunged back into the world of boot camps in the Bundu, former security policemen offering Strauly advice, and torrid defeats to England and New Zealand in the 2003 World Cup in Australia. South African rugby has always been about Manichaean opposites, good and evil, dark and light, and now it had regressed back to the place where many felt that it truly belonged, the Dark Ages. But this isn't a discourse about the respective merits of Springbok coaches since readmission. It's more than that. It's an attempt to tease out how the culture of the game has changed to the point where we find ourselves the envy of the rugby world today. One of the obvious ways in which the game has changed for the better in the last 25 years is that refereeing in the 1990s was remarkably inconsistent. We only have to look at Mallet's 2 home tests against Ireland, particularly the second one, to realize that. In Mallet's time, for example, there was no television match official or TMO. There was no trial by TV either. Referees were well rewarded on the after-dinner speaking circuit, but they weren't the media celebrities they are today. They didn't gel their hair, they didn't chat to the players, and they didn't work out in the gym. Mallet's first assignment upon being made Bok coach was to take the Springbok team to Europe at the end of 1997. His side was astonishingly full of talent, and Mallet harnessed that talent by encouraging an expansive game. They won all tests on tour, including a thumping victory over Scotland at Murrayfield and beating France twice in Lyon and Paris. The second of these 2 victories was a 52-10 drubbing at Parc des Princes. It mattered not, apparently, that the French were the previous season's 5 Nations champions and would be the 5 Nations champions in the season to come. The Boks simply waltzed into Paris, scored with almost the first move of the game through an outside break by centre Andre Snyman, and put the champion team of the North to the sword. It was all in a day's work. The following season's incoming tourists were Ireland, just like they are today. The 1998 team were captained by Paddy Johns, a lock with a temper and a bit of bottle. They were a handy side who, in the previous 5 Nations, had only lost by a point to Scotland and 2 to France, although they finished bottom of the table. John's locking partner was Malcolm O'Kelly, later to tour south with 2 British and Irish Lions teams, and one of the foundational members of what was to become the great Leinster European Cup winning side. Conor O'Shea was a slick, attacking fullback, and Keith Wood, the Munster man, had toured South Africa with the victorious Lions of the previous season. Truth be told, this mattered very little. The Springboks won the first test in Bloem 37-13, the margin of victory far wider than the scoreline suggested. Stefan Terblanche scored 4 tries on debut, and the story is told that 2 tries in, Joost van der Westhuizen gathered the troops round and told them to dispense with the game plan. Quote, "Let's just get the ball to Stefan as quickly as possible," said Joost, ever the pragmatist, "and he'll do the rest." Forgive me while I interrupt a sports story to tell you about the Luke Alfred Show Patreon. As you may know, being a writer is not the most lucrative career choice. Please consider making a small donation to keep the show going at patreon.com/The Luke Alfred Show. But for now, let's get back to the story. Something happened in Bloem or after Bloem that had dire consequences for the second test. The Irish, coached by Warren Gatland, either decided that they couldn't or wouldn't compete at Loftus. Their best bet, or so they appeared to reason, was to turn the second test into a running brawl. As a technical analysis, it doesn't amount to much, but there you go. At the same time, it is foolish to make too many hard and fast generalizations about the second test, about who threw the first punch and who retaliated. For reasons of aesthetic symmetry rather than anything else, let's start our deep dive into the second test with Van der Westhuizen, who can be seen in some of the videos kicking O'Kelly. It was the 14th minute of the test, the scores were still where they began, and tempers were already fraying. O'Kelly had found himself marginally on the wrong side of a ruck, if we are being generous, and Joost took the opportunity to kick O'Kelly while he was on the ground. This Van der Westhuizen did in full sight of the French referee, Joël Dumais, which was pretty brazen, but Van der Westhuizen was enraged about something, so took matters into his own hands by putting in the boot. In his white jersey, with the Irish playing in green, Van der Westhuizen couldn't help himself. The red mist descended. Dumais, in all blue, pulled out the yellow, and Van der Westhuizen retreated without a shred of contrition. He was possibly considering that he'd got off scot-free, although he was also possibly wondering whether, if the opportunity should so arise, he should kick O'Kelly, or someone else for that matter, again, given that he had got off his first offence so lightly. Although Van der Westhuizen and O'Kelly were not the major culprits, we will come to the true villains in a moment, this was the match in a nutshell. The second test between South Africa and Ireland at Loftus Versfeld on June the 20th, 1998, Mallet's seventh test in charge, was a running battle punctuated by some passages of rugby, some of them rather good. As far as the skullduggery was concerned, the match had it all. It was a veritable highlights reel of foul play, a tit-for-tat drama of bad-temperedness. There were late tackles, there were high tackles, there was jersey pulling, barging, eye-gouging, kicking, slapping, fist-throwing, fist-fighting, jumping, obstruction, rucking, hacking, every mean low-down trick in the book. There was so much foul play that it was impossible for Dumais to deal with it all. A referee is obliged to follow the ball, but so much of the foul-temperedness took place off the ball, or behind Dumais' back, that he was simply overwhelmed by all that he couldn't see. The idea that he was overwhelmed is supported by the fact that he gave only 3 yellow cards in the entire test. We've already heard about the card he gave to Van der Westhuizen, and there were cards given also to Ireland's Victor Costello in the first half and South Africa's Crano Otto in the second. A first yellow card in those days was a kind of staging post. It might be upgraded to red if you received a second yellow, but if you remained on just 1 yellow, you stayed on the field of play throughout. The thinking here, of course, was that the first yellow was a deterrent, preventing you from further infringements. The counter-argument to all this, however, is that how much of a deterrent can it be if your punishment requires you to remain on the field of play? All I can tell you is that this is how it was. There was no TMO in the match, and although both touch judges helped and intervened, their roles were also circumscribed by lack of replay technology. One of the ironies of the so-called Battle of Loftus is that the two villains on the day weren't given even 1 yellow card, let alone 2. So, who were they? By consensus, they were held to be the Irish skipper Johns and the Springbok hooker James Dalton, who, more than most, was always looking for a jaw on which to plant his fist or a chest to sink his knee into. He found more than a few opportunities to do so at Loftus, and so did Johns, who probably reckoned that the Irish were likely to be steamrolled on the hard fields of the Highveld anyway, and wanted to go out with the satisfaction of landing a couple of hefty blows. With all the niggle taking place in so many different places, perhaps it's not that surprising that Dumais didn't send anyone off, because he couldn't find the right guy. With 30 big men running into each other, rugby is a big game. With so many big players around him taking the law into their own hands, so Dumais was prevented from taking the law into his. Truth to tell, it all got big on Dumais in such a way that he was only nominally in charge of the test at all. Ed Morrison, the referee in the World Cup final at Ellis Park 3 years previously, was one of the 2 touch judges on the day, and he tried to help Dumais, but it was of no use. Dumais either couldn't or wouldn't be helped, and so the test became an exhibition of end-to-end foulness. It was a sad day, but also a hilarious day, in that there's a double take in watching all the mayhem on the replays. How can this be going on, you ask yourself? How can the referee be under the impression that he's got this game under control? How can an international game of rugby be so pitifully ill-disciplined and so much fun simultaneously? In between all the niggle, there was also some pretty decent rugby. Dalton scored a first-half try next to the corner flag after a flowing move, and Peter Rousseau, with those long, colt-like legs of his, scored a peach in the second, coming in off his left foot to leave the Irish cover defence spread-eagled, as if the entire cast of Riverdance had somehow slid off the stage in the wrong direction. I've spoken about the inherent institutional instability. Pretty neat alliteration, don't you think, of South African rugby during the period. I've also spoken about the fact that if the mood took, teams could generally get away with murder by intimidating referees with the sheer scope of foul play. The one thing we haven't yet discussed are the fractious politics of the game in the late 1990s, which, thanks to good governance nowadays, have all but receded from the contemporary game. When Mallet took over from du Plessis as Bok coach, Louis Late was president of the SA Rugby Football Union. Late was an impressive, hectoring and bullying man, and, increasingly, his credentials came under scrutiny by the newly emergent black elite, impatient with the rate of change, both in the boardroom and on the field of play. Late was accused of nepotism and treating the game as his personal fiefdom, and, in retaliation, Late called Nelson Mandela as witness as matters headed to court. It was the wrong move. Any lingering support Late might have had disappeared. In early May 1998, Late faced a motion of no confidence from his SA Rugby Football Union board. A couple of days later, he resigned. Only one black player played any part in the Island series, and that was McNeil Hendricks, who came on as a second-half substitute in the Loftus test and scored a try. Mallet was not notably open to black players, but then he didn't need to be. He had the luxury of bringing a player as crazily gifted as Bobby Skinstad off the bench. Was there a black player Skinstad's equal that Mallet might use instead? There wasn't. It was a non-debate. The system the administrators were in charge of wasn't producing the black players they wanted him to choose. If they weren't producing, or helping to produce, the players they wanted him to select, was he expected to click his fingers and produce them himself? It might have been a non-debate in the rarefied world of international rugby, but this was South Africa, and South Africa of the late 1990s was a troubled place, a place which shouldn't be confused with the rarefied world of international rugby. It was a place where there was immense jockeying for power, much contestation, much unhappiness from black South Africans with the pace of change. This contestation took place around the appropriateness of the Springbok emblem. It took place around the racial composition of our national teams. This debate haunted South African rugby for 15 years, but 5 or 6 years ago, prior to the 2019 World Cup win in Japan, it started slowing down. It has lost momentum ever since. If we agree that South African rugby is, to borrow a phrase from the American short story writer Raymond Carver, in its, quote, salad days, what might those days be called, broadly speaking? A great enlightenment that sees Leinster employ Jacques Nienaber and Glasgow Warriors employ Franco Smith. This flowering sees Rassie Erasmus take over seamlessly from Nienaber, and 4 South African teams appear in 3 consecutive URC finals. On the face of it, they are the best of rugby days. We should enjoy them in the understanding that they might not come this way again. They are the best of rugby days partly because this generation of players are so remarkably good at their jobs. But they are also the best and most successful rugby days because the entire rugby environment is peaceful. Yes, Eben Etzebeth's racial credentials might get questioned, but that was during the last World Cup. Yes, Bongi Mbonambi might have uttered foul-mouthed obscenities to England's Tom Curry, but this is players, not the administrators, getting into trouble. And the trouble is relative and normal. And because we, and not England, are Rugby World Cup winners, South Africans can afford to be indulgent around the second matter at least. We are the Rugby World Cup winners and England aren't, and that's all there is to it, really. Although these are the best of rugby days, they are unlikely to last forever. South Africa's junior teams are faltering. Money has become a problem for SA Rugby, and you wonder if it's simply sentimentality that keeps a competition like the Currie Cup alive. Then again, the Springboks keep on winning. They have an unrivaled bench in international terms, and they have a generation of players, from Handré Pollard to Pieter-Steph du Toit, who know how to win. Australia and New Zealand have suffered more from South Africa's absence in Super Rugby than South Africa have suffered from not playing them, and the move to the north has turned out to be visionary. There's now a central corridor of world power moving south across the equator from the north. The corridor shares the same time zone, always good for television, and will yet prove to be the greatest concentration of rugby power the game has ever seen. Stranded in the east, New Zealand and Australia will feel the creep of the rugby cold. If our administrators want to prove that they are truly visionary, their vision should extend beyond playing matches at Twickenham against Wales. They should really be thinking seriously of joining the Six Nations, if encouraged to do so. They wouldn't, however, play at home in South Africa, using instead a base in Europe like Amsterdam or Lisbon as a venue to attract South Africans living and working in Britain to the Springboks' European matches. Every away game could be a home one, in a manner of speaking. So, as we prepare to take on Ireland for the second time in 2 weeks, let's cast our mind back to when South African rugby was addicted to crisis. Even when the Boks were winning, we sensed, deep down, that a loss was just around the corner. Remember when Rassie was referred to by commentators as Johan Erasmus, and every rugby-mad fan in the nation didn't talk about him as if he only had one name. Remember when late, to some the epitome of the self-made man, to others the very definition of a boorish bully, was still a feature of the South African rugby landscape. Remember how long ago was this, when Jake White was a water boy in the Springbok camp during Mallet's tenure as coach. Remember. Why bother with all the injunctions to memory, you may well ask? For one, it helps us appreciate what a fine and healthy position South African rugby finds herself in today. It didn't always look so peachy, believe me. If you enjoyed this episode of The Luke Alfred Show, please give me a 5-star rating. As an independent creator, this podcast is made possible through your support.